Good morning, everyone. So for the riff this morning, I'm going to continue the conversation that I started last week about hinging and squatting. And just to review, when I talk about hinging, that is something like in yoga, Utkatasana or a deadlift. And squatting is coming fully down. The hips are in a deeper flexion. And there's some other things that happen in the pelvis and in the legs that differentiate these two things. The commonality between them is hip flexion or the pelvis anteverting in relation to the legs. But obviously there's more of an angle, a sharper crease with squatting compared to hinging. And there are other important differences. And today I want to talk about the feet in relation to that. So there are changes in the pelvis that happen between hinging and squatting, and there are changes in the legs and the feet. And it's kind of complex, but it's really elegant and worth understanding. So even if some of this, if you feel like you don't quite get everything this morning that I'm talking about, that's completely normal and fine. And it's good to just keep exploring it, keep referring back to this and other videos that will be in this series. And I'll just mention that this is part of the skill of the month for this month, which is hinging and squatting. So here we have a skeleton who has a pelvis, and I'm just going to do a little review from last week because it will inform what I talk about today. So in a hinge, we have more of an internal rotation state in the pelvis. And what that means is the front crest of the pelvis comes slightly in, and you'll see here the sitting bones widen. Okay? So from the side, the sitting bones, that back part of the pelvis gets opened as the front part of the pelvis comes closer together. So there is, we could say, a concentric activation in the front. The deep abdominal muscles are engaging to draw the front pelvic crest together, and the sitting bones widen and back. If you yourself come into Utkatasana here, you can likely feel that the sitting bones are widening. You might try that out. And the movement of the pelvic crest is not quite as dramatic. Some people may feel that, some people may not, but as you come down, there's a sense of the front pelvic crest drawing closer together. And along with that, coupled with that, the sacrum nutates. That is, nutation means to nod. Nutare in Latin is to nod. That is the broad part of the sacrum comes into the body. The tail end of the sacrum flares back. And that's part of, so the whole back base of the pelvic floor is eccentrically opening. There's more space between the sitting bones and the tail. If you think about the sitting bones and the tail as a kind of triangle at the back base of the pelvis, that area expands as the front area condenses. So that is hinging. And if you want a little more on this, you can go back to the first video that came out last week. In squatting, the opposite situation occurs. We counternutate the sacrum. The broad part of the sacrum actually goes back, and the front crest of the pelvis widen. And this is to accept the abdominal contents coming down into the basin of the pelvis. So there's a little bit of, you could think of the sacrum as slightly back bending. And in that case, the pelvic crests, they open. So where in the nutation, the pelvic crests draw in, here the pelvic crests widen, and this is more of an external rotation. If we consider the pelvis as a global unit. The pelvis as a whole is externally rotating, it's expanding at the top, but the sitting bones come in, it's concentric at the bottom. Okay, so that's the bit of review. I'm going into depth of that a little bit because it's helpful to hear it again and understand it. So now in the feet, there are corresponding internal and external rotations in the feet. So when we come into a squat, I'll start with the squat. We have an external rotation position in the pelvis, and similarly, there is an external rotation orientation in the feet. So the feet are often described in terms of what people most commonly hear is pronation and supination. There's also people talk about eversion and inversion, but I'm not going to describe this in terms of pronation and supination, but I'll just say pronation is more internal rotation. It's the inner edge of the foot rolling in. That's our equivalent to internal rotation. Supination is more external rotation. So when you come into a squat, you can likely feel that there tends to be more weight on the outer edge of the foot. And we're putting ourselves into a situation of external rotation in the feet that corresponds to the external rotation pattern in the pelvis. Sometimes that can happen to such a degree that we want to counter that by drawing the inner heels down into the floor. Another way you can think about this in terms of understanding squatting is because of that external rotation bias, for many of us, it is helpful to have the feet turned slightly out coming into the squat, and that makes the negotiation easier to come down into the squat, also to have the knees out. So this is really, once we get into the squat, there's a kind of linked external rotation pattern that is expressed in the pelvis, in the legs, and in the feet. Okay? There are more subtleties and intricacies with this in the sense that to get into that, there's differentiation. There's differentiation potentially in the feet, such as like the forefoot can internally rotate and the heels can externally rotate, or vice versa. There's all kinds of things that happen with that in walking. There's sequencing to it, but I want to give the broad strokes of this. So the basic takeaway is squatting has an emphasis in external rotation. Pelvis, legs, feet. And hinging, you might expect, has more of a patterned expression in internal rotation in the legs and in the feet. So to the angle that when we come into a hinge, the angle that the hips are in, the angle that the knees are in, it's going to tend to internally rotate the foot. These connections are helpful because very often when someone has difficulty coming into one or the other or both of these patterns, we can look at what's happening in the pelvis, we can look at what's happening in the knees, in the ankles and the feet, and encourage those rotations. So people often think of these patterns more sagittally, just as, okay, we're hinging. This is a straight up and down movement. But the rotations are really essential for expressing the pattern, expressing the movement. And often when someone has difficulty, it's about a lack of rotation or rotations that are actually going the opposite way from what we really want to express. So I'm going to continue this discussion next week, but that's enough for now. The basic takeaway in hinging, not only is the pelvis organized in internal rotation, but the legs and the feet are as well. And in squatting, not only is the pelvis organized in external rotation, but the legs and the feet are also. So Thank you very much. That's our riff for this morning.